Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Jean Cannon. I am the curator for North American Collections here at Hoover Library and Archives. I'm delighted to see you all here today. We are very excited here at Hoover to host this event, which is the first in our speaker series for our current Hoover Archives exhibition, Unprecedented: Watergate and Power in America. As many of you know, this year is the 50th anniversary of the watershed moment of the resignation of President Richard Nixon. And so here at Hoover, we thought we would take the opportunity to showcase the many collections that we have here of individuals who had worked in the Nixon White House and were involved in the Watergate affair, including John Ehrlichman. We just opened his papers, Jeb Magruder and Robert Mardian, amongst many others. For those of you who have not seen the exhibition yet, I encourage you to step right next door into Hoover Tower. We'd love to have you. The exhibition is free and open to the public. And please come and explore artifacts that really bring to life this monumental moment in American political history. Today, we are also delighted to welcome John Roy Price, who is going to give us his eyewitness accounts of the Nixon White House and the policies that Nixon and his administration sought to put into place in the early 1970s. During Nixon's White House tenure, John was special assistant to the president and executive secretary of the Council on Urban Affairs and the Council of Rural Affairs, both of which the president chaired. He worked closely with Daniel Patrick Moynihan and John Ehrlichman and was centrally involved in Nixon's social policy development, focusing especially on welfare and health insurance, welfare reform and health insurance, excuse me. John is also recently the author of The Last Liberal Republican, an insider's perspective on Nixon's surprising social policy. The book was first published in 2021 by the University of Press of Kansas and is in a paperback edition, was published last year. I see that some of you already have the book. We are happy to report that we have copies of the book available, and John will be kind enough to sign some copies after the talk today. So please feel free to pick one up from the table outside. Also, I'm very pleased to announce that John has donated his own archives to Hoover, which has already been a treasure trove to researchers interested in the Nixon era and the development of public policy. And here I want to note that John, a wise and lucky man, actually left the Nixon White House right before Watergate, which he wanted me to mention. And so this collection is doesn't exactly have all of the smoking guns that you might see in the gallery right now, but still we are delighted to have it as part of our collections here. So in addition to having vast experience in political campaigns and governance, John is also a graduate of Grinnell College and Harvard Law School, a former Rhodes Scholar, and the retired president and CEO of the Federal Loan Bank of Pittsburgh. So we welcome him. We're delighted to have you, John. I'm not quite done. Just a few housekeeping notes. Before we get started properly. So before I turn this over to John, I want to remind everyone we will have two additional lectures in our speaker series for this exhibition. On June 17th, the anniversary of the Watergate break-in, we will be hosting Chapman University professor Dr. Luke Nichter. And Dr. Nichter is probably the foremost living expert on the Nixon White House tapes. And so he will be talking with us about the historical legacy of those tapes and the Watergate affair in general. So please join us for that. And then on August 8th, the anniversary of Nixon's resignation, we will welcome author Heath Hardage Lee, who in August is publishing a new biography of Pat Nixon entitled The Mysterious Mrs. Nixon, The Life and Times of Washington's Most Private First Lady. So, come back and join us and mysteries will be revealed. I also want to take a minute to thank Hoover's director, Condoleezza Rice, and our director of the Library and Archives, Eric Waken. And also, we thank the many donors and supporters without whose help we could not have these wonderful collections and exhibitions and lectures here on Hoover's campus. And then in terms of housekeeping for those of us joining us on Zoom, please feel free to put your questions in the chat, and we will get to as many of them in the Q&A as we can. And also, most importantly for all here, lunch. We will have lunches available after the talk, so please pick one up over here in this corner of the room and go enjoy some of this lovely weather that we're having in Palo Alto right now. Okay, now I will turn the podium over to John, and he can share with you his firsthand experience of the last liberal Republican. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much, Jean. And I want also to thank Tanya and also Lucy, who is going to be serving as the processing archivist on my papers, which are somewhere down below us by now. And thank you so much. Your organization is spectacular. Your personnel the same. And I must say, you could not have a greater diplomat and acquirer than Jean is herself. She's terrific. So thank you. And I want to try and take you through a period which relates to the documents that I now have in your basement. They are relevant to that era in my life, about a decade in my life. And they're also very redolent for me of memories, which are very powerful still and very, very present in mind. And I hope that you'll enjoy a bit of a tour that I can give you today of them. Let me begin by saying that for those of you who are not fortunate enough to be here present with us today, if you're able to see the screen with the Hoover Tower here in the present, you will see it is a spectacular sky blue day. It is exactly like that outside this morning, so enjoy. This is the book of which you are already well aware. Let me talk for a moment about what I call the period of the mid-century, 20th century presidential wing of the Republican Party. This is an era which could even cover Alf Landon, the governor of Kansas, who ran against Franklin Roosevelt in one of the most hapless presidential campaigns of all, 36. Wilkie, of course, in 1940. Tom Dewey, the progressive Republican governor of New York, who ran twice unsuccessfully, once against FDR, a dying FDR in 1944, and then against Harry Truman in 48. These are people you probably never heard of, but by the time that the Eisenhower campaign began to shape, these were two of the most critical people behind the scenes. On the left is Walter Thayer, and on his right is John Hay Whitney. Whitney's father, when he died, Payne Whitney, in 1920s, left the largest estate in American history at that point. It was succeeded later only by John D. Rockefeller Sr. Whitney became the wheel horse, the champion financially behind the moderate wing, or that presidential wing, as I call it, of the Republican Party. He bought, to his everlasting financial remorse, the Herald Tribune, the New York Herald Tribune, which was the house organ of the Eastern Republican establishment, much like the Chicago Tribune in the Midwest was of the traditional conservatives. Thayer was his ally in this, and later was president of the Trib when I got to know them both. They were crucially important because they bridged the Eisenhower administration with what came later. Eisenhower was at its apogee in the 56 election, his re-election, really the complete summation of what he called modern republicanism. And Eisenhower and people like Thayer and Whitney and many others thought that Eisenhower and the others returning from the European and Japanese theaters had just fought and won a world war. They were not ready to go to battle again against the New Deal. And that's a critical thing to bear in mind about Eisenhower and Nixon. Eisenhower vastly expanded Social Security. He also laid the foundation for the biggest increase in coverage of healthcare in American history before Medicare, Medicaid came in, the employer-sponsored plans, which was a gimmick, if you will, using the Internal Revenue Code of 1954. I am no longer, but once was, a tax lawyer. And so I can tell you that the code has powerful impact on people's behavior. This was fascinating. And as I say, it vastly increased health coverage for American families because at that time, don't forget, labor unions were much more prevalent and powerful. And the deal that Eisenhower cut was not with budgetary impact, but rather using the tax code. So he created a whole melange of health programs that employers were able to expense against their tax liabilities, but families of employees didn't have to show as income. So we'll come back to that. But that was the apogee, the high water mark was 56. Well, what had happened in the meantime was that the conservatives had been suppressed by Eisenhower. And they began to feel their oats again in 1959-60. And you remember that Nixon's quest for the presidential nomination seemed sure and certain, but he was suspect with the conservatives, as he ever remained, because of his cutting a deal with Nelson Rockefeller. Nelson Rockefeller was then the governor of New York. They cut what they called the Fifth Avenue Compact, in which Nixon agreed to virtually everything the freshman governor of New York, Nelson Rockefeller, wanted him to do. It was quite a liberal agenda. And so the conservatives were feeling ructions about that. And so after the 60 defeat, the conservative movement began in force, and it wound up 4 years later with Barry Goldwater as the nominee of the party. But it was very important because there was a lot of yeast and animation on that side of the party and American politics. You had William F. Buckley Jr. forming the National Review at that time. You had the creation of various membership organizations like the American Conservative Union, and you had a Young Americans for Freedom, if any of you remembers that group. And these groups gradually took over the Republican Party from the foundation up. The leadership was still, until it was toppled, the leadership was still very much in the hands of the establishment and people who'd held office and so on. But John Hay Whitney and I were in an elevator together in San Francisco, nearby when the Cow Palace convention was held in '64, which nominated Goldwater. And we stepped out, the doors closed behind us, and he turned to me and said, "John," this was a man who'd been finance chairman of 2 Eisenhower campaigns. He knew everybody in the old party. He said, "John," he said, "I don't know anybody." There had been a complete revolution from the bottom up, taking over the Republican Party. Well, offsetting that, much less, in a way, influential and certainly less numerous, was the Ripon Society. This was a sort of yeasty young group here. I'm sorry, let me go back. And this is a very young me. This is our executive committee in the spring of 1965. This was my last year at law school, and I was the first paid employee of Ripon, and I worked 20 hours a week for Ripon while finishing my law school. It was a busy time in my life. This is a group of folks who went on to all kinds of careers. The top left became one of the most senior members of Congress. The gentleman next to him became the publisher of the International Herald Tribune in Paris, and then head of the George Washington University Media and Public Affairs Law School, then law school, real estate, political science, engineering, district attorney, and then business executive. We went everywhere. But at this moment, the Ripon Society was a group of young people, young professionals, who were sort of modeling themselves on a group that had been formed in Great Britain called the Bow Group, B-O-W. And the Bow Group was sort of allied with the Conservative Party in Great Britain, the Tory Party. And its idea, its sort of focus was to try to become a bridge or a conduit between the academic world on the one hand and the Tory Party, Conservative Party policymakers on the other. It was a very early version of a think tank, although it was partisan. It was connected to the Tory Party. Well, the Ripon Society consciously modeled ourselves on that. And one of the first things we did, and that I took an interest in as the research director, was work on welfare reform, as Jean corrected herself. And this was interesting because it's hard to think, I mean, a few of you may dimly recall that era, but the reality is that in 1967, 68, a hot button political issue, as much so nearly as immigration is today, was welfare. And it's very interesting that Pat Moynihan had become an early expert on welfare. We're hearing a lot about Pat. And what we tried to do was to figure out where we could go with welfare reform. You had an interesting period when, in American economic history, the unemployment rate was declining. It was going down steadily going into 1968, but the welfare caseload rate was on an uptick, which was dramatic and uninterrupted. So there was some kind of a disconnect between what you would think would be the foundational reason for welfare benefits being paid, which is to offset the problems of poverty exacerbated by high unemployment. But no, Moynihan was the first to spot that, but the public at large spotted it too. And it was viewed as it had become, they thought it was a Black female urban problem. And so it excited all kinds of racial tensions as well as pure fiscal or economic concerns. And so this was going on at the same time that I wound up working with Nelson Rockefeller, the governor of New York, who was a perennial candidate for the presidential nomination, never quite made it. But he was sort of Mr. Big Government, Mr. Liberal within the party at that time, and Goldwater was the counterpoint to him, and of course managed to wrest the nomination away from Nelson in 1964. And I did the original Oppo research on Barry Goldwater for Nelson Rockefeller in 1963. It goes back a while, dates me, but everything else does. So Rockefeller lost, but remained a formidable figure within the party. And I ran his delegate intelligence unit 4 years later for the 68 campaign, which was brief-lived and again, hapless, but it was a real interesting experience for me. And fascinatingly, right after we lost, Nixon sent under flags of truce to me a couple of mutual friends asking me to work in the general election campaign. I had run a piece of Rockefeller's campaign against him, and yet he reached out, which to me is indicative of a constant point about Richard Nixon. He was broad church. And that just shows up time after time. Among the more powerful points along that is this relationship. And let me enlarge the picture for you because it gives you a sense of the relationship these two enjoyed. If you look, here's Nixon just almost with his head thrown back, laughing. A little hard for you to imagine Richard Nixon in quite this mode, right? But it was true. And here's Moynihan, if you see, looking puckish or impish, which was his way. And this was taken 2 years into their relationship in the White House. Well, Pat had been an active, ardent Democrat, partisan, office-seeking Democrat. He'd served with Jack Kennedy, served with Lyndon Johnson. In 1968, he first worked for Bob Kennedy. And then when Kennedy was assassinated, he worked for Hubert Humphrey. Richard Nixon reached out to him and gave him the top urban affairs policy post in his administration, as he did Henry Kissinger on the other side, two Harvard academics who were hardly able to be accused of being conservative Republicans. And going on from there, what happened was they worked together toward the creation of a body within the government, which very importantly showed Nixon's interest both in process as well as in policy. And here is the so-called Council for Urban Affairs. And as Jean briefly mentioned, it was made up of all of the members of the domestic cabinet in the entire government. And this is the very first executive order of his presidency. It was 3 days after the inauguration. And in the back was Pat Moynihan overseeing things. He was the executive secretary, the full-time staff director for that. Over here on your left is a friend of most of you, George Shultz. And interestingly, at this very first meeting, what Nixon did after he had everybody sit around, and I had been appointed the official rapporteur or minute taker for these meetings, Nixon said, well, why don't we go around and each of you introduce yourselves to one another, because this is your first meeting, and tell each other a bit about your department and its authorities, its role. And we started out with George Romney, who's the father of Mitt, and who'd been a very proud man and had been president of American Motors and governor of Michigan, a rival for Nixon's nomination. And he'd come in as Secretary of Housing, one of the newest departments. And George Romney took off on a riff of his department's authority. And speaking in terms we're more familiar with now in constitutional law, the way he described that authority would not be viewed as strict constructionist. And so rather he was expansive. And then they went around the table, and one thing that I noted, which fascinated me, was George Shultz at the very tail end, as one of the most junior departments, just sort of had sat and taken it all in. And then as a model of taciturnity, he just said very little about his department. He was taking the measure of his peers. And that was very effective for working with Richard Nixon. It worked out very well for him. Then I want to get on a little bit more about the council itself and its support from the Moynihan staff. What he was trying to do was to take account of the fact that the year or two before he was elected were horrendous years in American society. And over 120 cities were burning, arson, race rioting, and they were bringing cities to their knees. And so that's one of the reasons why Nixon, reached out to Moynihan, because Moynihan was the head of the Harvard-MIT Joint Center for Urban Studies. And so he had some, formal awareness of and connection to these problems. Also, he was a Democrat. And also Nixon just knew he had to do something about urban affairs and the riots. So creating this body as a cabinet level like the National Security Council was, for Nixon, a very important thing optically as well as substantively. And at the same time, Nixon being Nixon, he is not an incompetent tactician in terms of political tactics. And so the very same morning that we held this first meeting with Moynihan in his glory, leading the discussion of all the cabinet members, Nixon appoints Arthur Burns as counselor to him for domestic policy. So it was almost as though he couldn't really give Moynihan full command of the portfolio, but rather Burns was a political offset to palliate the conservatives, who were obviously in a frenzy about these top two appointments of Kissinger and Moynihan at the helm of the ship of state with Nixon. So that was very interesting, and it's always a calibrated balance for Nixon of the GOP conservatives, and they were skeptical of him forever. And it set up, that competition with Burns set up a tug of war, which was interesting because Burns, who later became the chairman of the Fed, you may remember, Federal Reserve Board, but Burns was an archetypal, thoughtful conservative, and he was fighting every inch of the way as Nixon himself embraced many, many progressive ideas on social policy. And it became a sort of tug of war between Burns and Moynihan, and their seconds, if you will, if thinking of a duel, Martin Anderson, whose papers again are somewhere below where I speak, and myself. We were the seconds respectively to Arthur Burns and to Pat Moynihan. And that became part of a fascinating back and forth. You cannot imagine many presidents not being able to keep up. Nixon was getting lobbed over his transom memos on 19th century poor laws, which then had rebuttals thrown over the transom by Moynihan or me. And so he finally went on to embrace something which was very dramatic, but let me get you there, if I may. Before he even declared in 1968, I was lucky enough to go to a small dinner for Nixon in New York. There were about 10 of us. And 2 days later, he went to New Hampshire and filed for the New Hampshire primary and was off to the races. But what I was talking with him about was the work I'd unearthed with the Ripon Society about welfare reform. There was, to me, a fascinating convergence of views between the conservative economic theologians like Milton Friedman on the one hand, and many liberals who'd served in the Council of Economic Advisors in both Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson on something called a negative income tax. It was a response to this explosion in the welfare rolls. It was a sense of there must be a better way that will be more incentivizing people to work and to continue family adherence and consistency. So I talked to Nixon about this. I said, you know, you're about to start a campaign, and there is this bizarre connection now between the more liberal and the more conservative folks on welfare. Just as Moynihan, interestingly, was talking about how there must be some communication between the liberals and the conservatives because society was breaking up. And there was such extreme and polarization of positions, just like today. So Nixon was later hearing about Moynihan on that more sort of societal political front. He was hearing from me as a very junior guy about welfare reform, but he heard the phrase NIT, negative income tax. What the heck was that? Sounds bizarre. It was Milton Friedman's phrase and idea initially, which meant if you're a taxpayer, you have a marginal tax code. If you earn more, you pay more. A negative income tax is the mirror of that. And it simply means that if you are at the poverty line or near it or below it, and you have less income or you lose your job, it would be a supplement or a substitute for what had been income. It would make up lost income. It was a negative income tax where you get periodic payments from the Treasury if your income dropped or if it were consistently at or below the poverty line. So NIT, negative income tax. Remember that phrase. Anyway, so that was this is the front office, the cabinet members in the council. This is the back office. This is Moynihan's staff. And so there were all of 7 of us. And if you count Thomas Nast, there were 8 of us. The portrait of Thomas Nast, it's very revealing of Moynihan and his sense of humor. Thomas Nast, that's a self-portrait of the great political cartoonist in the 19th century who used to just spear Boss Tweed of Tammany all the time and made a good living out of that, frankly, with his cartoons. But he had fallen prey to some embezzler or some phony investment advisor, of whom there were legion then and there are legion today. And he'd gotten swindled out of his entire fortune. So this is a painting of him with the Trinity Church of Wall Street in the background and a sort of gloomy look on his face. This was our staff. This, again, is me over on the right. We were posing for this, trying to look a little pompous, which for me apparently came easily. Now, we were 7 or 8, if you count Nast, 7 on that staff of the newly formed cabinet level executive office of the president, presidentially chaired policy body. Henry Kissinger was the head of a staff of 38. So, of course, established in 1947, National Security Act, but nonetheless, they had a lot more horsepower and firepower. We did the very best we could. And in addition to my job of being the note taker and the follow-up guy for the council meetings, I was asked by Moynihan to take on welfare, which I was delighted in because that was his mother's milk. He loved that issue. His widow, Elizabeth, told me before she died last year that when he died, he was working again on a book on family poverty. This is basically the crucial insider group that made the welfare reform and so many other things happen. This is your friend John Ehrlichman, again, papers below somewhere. George Shultz, the same. Pat Moynihan, and of course, himself. And these 3 became crucially important as Nixon ruminated about what to do on welfare and finally took very aggressive action and for a long time fought for it. For over 2 years, fought for it. And what happened was we started out, when Moynihan said to me, Price, take welfare, I said, I have something to show you. I pulled up a model statute that had been published in the Yale Law Journal by the Ripon Society on a negative income tax. Moynihan had been wedded to something called the family allowance, which was a European-style capitation grant like George McGovern later proposed, the demo grant, $1,000 per child and parent. And he was still embracing that. And I said, no. I said, the Republicans will never buy it. The sticker price is huge. It's vast. And so I said, think about a negative income tax, which is a far less hugely sapping thing on the federal budget, but which is effective for what you want to do. Well, anyway, he chewed on it and chewed on it and chewed on it. Finally, I started to work very closely with the HEW, then the department relevant to these issues, on drafts of two options. One was a reform of the existing welfare program, setting some state minimum standards. The other was this full-blown negative income tax or aid to families, including fathers' families. And I took a draft of my paper into Pat. This was another little piece of color about him. After I'd worked on the first draft, and this was the second draft, and I dropped it off for him in the morning, and I got this call from his secretary to come over about the end of the day. And I went in his office, and he took my draft and he slammed it down on his desk, and he said, "Price, your prose is opaque." And so I spent all night rewriting it. And the third draft that morning was the one that went to Richard Nixon at Key Biscayne, and on which he basically concluded he was going to go with a brand new form of welfare reform. And then George Shultz became crucially important to it, because Shultz said, and this was all part of our council work, George Shultz said, wait, you've got to have the working poor in this. The working poor, meaning the families that may have 2, 3, 5 kids, and they may have work, but it's too little for them. They can't make it. And so he kept pounding and pounding and pounding. Moynihan bought into it. And then Ehrlichman became the crucial sort of mediator. And here's Arthur Burns, as I say, off in the corner, attempting to sell Nixon on something far short of that. But these were the guys who made it happen. And while all this was percolating, there were moments of pleasure and distraction and absolutely incredible opportunity. And for me, one of those was here. That is that in July of that year, while Nixon still hadn't announced his welfare decision, Apollo 11 was launched from Cape Canaveral, Cape Kennedy. And Pat and I were on Air Force Two and flew down for it. And it was an incredible spectacle. And then some days later, we were in the cabinet room, not he and I, but I am again right there with my back to the Oval Office, door to the Oval Office. And there was a small group of us that watched the landing and then watched the moonwalk and so forth. This is Dwight Chapin, who I think has been here in the past and who was the body man to Nixon, the scheduler. Here's Ollie Atkins, the president's photographer, who for once was not behind the shutter, but in front of the lens and enjoying it with us. We all are smoking cigars, politically improper today. But this was great because the landing was there, and I, single at the time, I had a date with a woman that evening, and I phoned her to confirm. She said, "John, I'm sorry, I got to cancel." So as it happens, Chapin said, "Well then, come on in. We're going to be with Nixon when he talks to the astronauts on the moon." So I was there with 5 people and a pool press photographer. That moment, breathtaking. So I've thanked that woman the rest of my life. Then we worked up to it. Nixon announced his decision. And this is where we get into the intra-party strains again, in a very real way. Nixon had embraced it. He said to Moynihan, he said, it's a gamble on human nature, but he said it's one we've got to take because the existing welfare structure and caseload and direction is unsustainable. So what Nixon did then, he turned to me and he said, I'm going to invite Reagan. This is just days after he announced his decision on welfare. He said, I'm going to invite Reagan into my place in San Clemente, do me a briefing paper on Family Assistance Plan. That was the name it came to own, FAP. And I want to try and sell it to Reagan and the conservatives in the party. And so he then invited me to come to the meeting, as I did. And so I was sitting there when the two of them were talking about welfare. Reagan, of course, was governor at that time. This is 69. He's 3 years into his term, and very powerful force within the party. And as I have in my diary, I said, Nixon could have done a little better job than he did on bringing Reagan on board in the briefing. But nonetheless, he tried his darndest. And Reagan was non-committal in the meeting. But what I heard, the atmospherics of it, and generally the dialogue, made me write that. I said, there we were at San Clemente. We were at seaside. We were at ocean level. And the surf you could see outside. It's one of the best stretches of surfing coastline in North America. And I said, there we were at sea level, but I felt as though I were atop a continental divide. To listen to the two of these people, these Republicans. One, Nixon, the more traditional Eisenhower centrist, with the, if you will, his views running down one stream from the continental divide of a stream of belief in government, that it was needed to address problems of people through policy, through program, through action. Reagan, on the other hand, going down a different side of the continental divide, saying government is the problem, and wanting to turn away from a government response. So to me, it was absolutely fascinating moment, a moment of an epiphany, if you will, for me. And what happened was that Nixon then fought like the devil for 2 years to get his welfare reform going. And Reagan began somewhat undercover to try and defeat it, or make sure it wasn't going to happen. And that went on for a long time. And also what happened was that Nixon realized that he wasn't going to get support from the liberals. And that was crushing to him in a way. But it was because he was Richard Nixon. There was just no two ways around it. He had created such an animus on the part of the liberal community, most of the liberal community. He still had good personal relationships with many of these people. He was very close to Jack Kennedy, of all people, and many others. He enjoyed, contrary to what you might think about him, he had cordial, even warm relationships. Well, then the year went on. Nixon was committed to that. Reagan was beginning to work against it. And then at the end of that year, I was appointed to succeed Moynihan. This is me here now taking Pat's place as executive secretary of basically the domestic cabinet. Here's Moynihan, here is Ehrlichman, here's Arthur Burns, George Romney, the president, and the rest. And so we were still on full-throated cry to try to get the welfare reform, but did not. And then there were two streams that were flowing together in this area of income maintenance or assistance for the very poor people. And I want to bring your attention to this picture. This gentleman here is Dr. Jean Mayer, a somewhat diminutive fellow who was then a professor of medicine at Harvard Medical School, went on to become the president of Tufts University. But he was a nutritionist. More than that, Jean Mayer, French, as you can tell, was in World War II. He fought with 40,000 French troops to protect the evacuation at Dunkirk of the British Allied force with the Poles and the Czechs that were fighting with them. He was captured and he killed his captor and escaped. He was recaptured by the SS. He escaped again, fracturing a leg, and he had a limp ever after. He then went on to North Africa and fought the Nazis there, and then he came back to metropolitan France. So he was not a limp-wristed, relaxed kind of a guy. He was very intense, very, very forceful personality. Moynihan succeeded in bringing Jean Mayer in to run the White House Conference on Food, Nutrition, and Health, which Nixon had announced in May. In fact, 55 years ago this week, May 6th of 1969, Nixon's very first message to Congress was about hunger and the poverty leading to hunger. And Nixon proposed in that speech a revision of the food stamp program. And I see I'm running out of time. So I will try and go from a trot into a canter. And anyway, this is the White House report on on a conference then held in December, which we sat down at Nixon's table, the three of us, and then he took the report and he pushed it over in front of me and he said, "You're in charge of follow-up," which I tried to do. But there had been a little bit of a war between food stamps and a cash program for the poor. And it was never finally resolved. But what happened was they had deferred Nixon's effort on food stamps until after the first salvo we made on a cash program, the negative income tax, or FAP, family assistance. But then there was tremendous political interest in food stamps and nutrition. So Nixon went ahead and got what he had proposed in May of '69, which was a complete rationalization of food stamp program. And it became a negative income tax. It was income tested for the benefits. That is, if your income dropped or sagged, you would be eligible for more food stamps, and the other way around. So that was very important. But this is, if I can, I want to spend a few minutes on this, because healthcare for Richard Nixon had a visceral impact. He had lost two older brothers to tuberculosis. There was, of course, no health insurance at that time. And so while they were suffering and then dying sequentially, their mother went off to an Arizona sanatorium and worked to help other patients in order to pay for the care for her own sons. In turn, they died. And Nixon always had this feeling, particularly about healthcare. And very quickly, to go back, there is a history, unlike welfare, where he was new to it, like most were in '69. Health insurance, he had taken an interest in the 40s when he was a young member of Congress. And Harry Truman won his election in '48, you'll remember. Harry Truman immediately proposed what you would call a single-payer, federally administered, federally financed healthcare program, insurance and care. And at that time, the Republican view on the Hill, more conservative, traditional Republicans, of whom Robert Taft of Ohio was sort of the doyen. And they were basically diffident or uninterested. To the extent they had any interest, they say, well, let's give a few dollars to the states and see if they care to do anything, they could do something. But it was that sort of relaxed view. Nixon's was different. Nixon and a guy named Jacob K. Javits, who was a House member from New York, the most liberal Republican member, and Ralph Flanders, a Republican liberal United States Senator from Vermont, and Irving Ives, the same from New York State. The four of them introduced a bill which said, no, we disagree with Harry Truman, we disagree with Bob Taft. We think the government, the federal government, has a role in healthcare and health insurance, and it should define standards and it should define benefits and make them uniform and standardized. And so he had that background from as long ago as 1949. And what had happened then was I put my hand up with John Ehrlichman. Moynihan was not involved in healthcare. So I put my hand up and I said to Ehrlichman, I'd love to work with you on health. And he said, you got it. So I did work on that. And we came up in 1971 with something very much like what Nixon had proposed in 1949, the National Health Insurance Standards Act, and then we had a family health insurance plan. We had FAP, now we have FIP, and then the $100 million cancer care initiative, which you've heard of. And the basic thing was Nixon then built on Eisenhower's idea, the 1954 Revenue Act reform of employers offering programs to their family, their employees. And he said, let's expand to the balance, meaning to the rest. And so what he did was through the employer connection, he mandated all employers of more than one employee to provide health insurance for their employees and their families, which was radical. And this is a picture of a group of us sitting around right after he proposed it. Here am I over here on the left, Nixon, of course, and this is Gerald Ford, who was the head of the Republicans in the House at the time, Elliot Richardson, who was the relevant secretary, and a couple of other White House staffers. And we were working with Congressman Burns, who was the number one Republican on the Ways and Means Committee, which is the relevant committee, and trying to assuage his concerns about employers being under too much pressure with that burden. And in fact, we did change it. We said any employer of 10 or more employees. But what it was doing was incredible. It would provide inpatient care, extended care, outpatient care, catastrophic cost protections, and employees were to bear 65% of the premium burden, and it was to rise after that. And if you were too poor and you couldn't pay any employment premium, the government was going to be eating it, paying it for you. So this covered all low-income families with children, not in employer plans. And then there was a plan in 1973, which was even broader. And this also covered singles and childless couples. And it was health insurance for everyone who did not get it through their employer or Medicare. Physician care in or out of hospital, lab tests and x-rays, medical devices, ambulance services, mental illness, alcohol or drug addiction, home health services, nursing home services. For children, preventive care up to age 6, eye exams, hearing exams, regular dental care. Then, here's the punchline. 40 years before Obama, Richard Nixon proposed covering pre-existing conditions, 40 years earlier. And he also said, we'll pay for any premiums you can't afford. And we will also pay for prescription drugs, not just on Medicare, but everybody on prescription drugs. So that was, again, pretty dramatic. And finally, you had a feeling at the, going back to Watergate, you had a feeling in the departments as 73 went into 74 that there was initiative being sapped away from the White House. They were on the defense, playing defense about Watergate. So more and more initiative was able to be exercised by the departments. Secretary of HEW was by then Caspar Weinberger, a name familiar, I'm sure, to all of you. And so Weinberger came back. This is the end of my story, and it hooks back away into Watergate because of the running room that Watergate gave to the department heads if they so chose. And so Weinberger became a very activist, aggressive secretary on both the welfare reform and on health insurance. On welfare reform, he came up with something called Big FAP. The right wing called it Big FAP. It was a doubling of the levels that Nixon had earlier proposed. And he also went for a flat out health insurance bill that I've just described. And here is the true and sad ending of the story. Both of them ended with Watergate and Nixon's resignation. But the healthcare thing was interesting because what did happen there was that Ted Kennedy and Richard Nixon got together and they were attempting to find the way toward the first truly national health insurance proposal. And there were secret meetings held in the basement of St. Mark's Episcopal Church on Capitol Hill in Washington. One of my dear friends, law school classmate, Ripon colleague, Frank Samuel, was the negotiator for our side, for Nixon and the Department of HEW. Stan Jones, who was Ted Kennedy's assistant, was Ted Kennedy's negotiator. And they almost got there. And it was only at the very end that it collapsed. And Frank Samuel, 20 years ago, wrote a fax to Stan Jones, 30 years ago, 20 years after the aborted effort. So this is Nixon's guy writing to Ted Kennedy's guy. And Frank says, for this alumnus of St. Mark's Cellar, the reasons for the failure in 1974 included a classic mix of personality, interest group politics, program objectives, and political ideologies. But the fundamental cause of failure was 1, liberal insistence on giving more benefits and taking more control, and 2, conservative belief in any official cost estimate for the massive new program. And the urban legend is that Ted Kennedy said, till his death, he said, the worst mistake of my career was not to embrace Richard Nixon so we could get health care program, a national health insurance program. And I thought it was an urban legend, but people have insisted that no, it's real. And I cornered Senator Dodd, a Democrat from Connecticut, at a lunch one day in Washington. I said, "Tell me, Senator, was it real?" He said, "John," he said, if Ted Kennedy told me that 10 times, he told me that 100 times. Yes, he really meant it. So I rest my case. Nixon has lines into the future with, of course, the child tax credit looking very much like his negative income tax, with his healthcare support proposals essentially undergirding Obamacare and its creation. So many ways. And so earned income tax credit, again, is a fruit of the tree of Nixon's proposal on welfare reform. So there is so much there. And I am so sorry, I could have gone on another hour, but I appreciate your attention and the opportunity to try to lay this out in front of you. And you can feel the conviction and the sadness on my part that on many aspects of this, we fought and failed. Thank you. So.